Hey, what's up guys? Welcome back. Hope you're all doing well. We've got what I consider to be an exciting video today. We're doing the last of the finishing work on this Unreal guitar kit from Precision Guitar Kits. This thing, as you guys know, is kind of built to my specs. I made the wood selections and everything. I did my finishing work on it, of course, and I'm really happy with how it turned out. May not be to everyone's taste. I did have some people give me some feedback on what they thought I should have done differently with the die work. In this video, we're putting on the amber, which I don't think everybody's gonna like, but I certainly do. I think it gives it some depth, makes it really interesting. And we're getting our clear coat job done. So this is a gloss finish on top, as you can probably see, and a satin on the back and the neck. That's a hard wax oil finish. And you'll see how that's all done in this video. If you're looking for one of these kits, or something like it, something kind of to your own specs with your own wood and whatnot, check out the link in the description below to Precision Guitar Kits. And if you want any of the finishing products, they're basically all Mohawk with the exception of the polish I used, where I'm trying out a new polish from Oxford that works really well. So check out the Mohawk stuff. You can go to mohawkconsumer.com. I think you can check out Mohawk through my Amazon link in the description, and they also sell it through Solo Music Gear. I have an affiliate link in the description for that as well. I think that's enough for now. Let's move into voiceover and you guys can see what I'm doing on this. Hope you enjoy the video. Let's get to it. So we jump right into it with the amber here. I've already sanded my sealer down to 600 grit at this point, and I'm going to fire some amber on there. You'll see me kind of taking my time with this, paying a lot of attention to make sure that everything looks good as I go, because this is a transparent color. And so with an opaque color, you can kind of layer it up, and if it's a little thicker in one spot than the other, it doesn't really matter that much. But with a transparent, every time you add to it, it's going to darken. So every time you go over an area again, every time you overlap, it's going to darken, which is fine. That's kind of the whole idea of it. But if you don't get it nice and even, you're going to be able to tell. So I'm focusing a lot here on making sure that my overlap is even, making sure that parts appear covered nicely, and making sure that it just generally looks good as I go. I'm also standing on this ridiculous little stool thing, so I'm also focusing on not falling over and hurting myself. But anyway, the overlap on a transparent paint depends a little bit on how dark you want to go. And, you know, if I was spraying with a gun, I'd be able to mix it as much as I wanted in terms of darkness, or, you know, I could cut it with clear or with extra thinner or something like that. And that's what I do when I get quarts of this stuff. But for the purpose of doing it with a spray can, you just kind of change your overlap and the amount that you're putting on there. So ideally for a transparent and for the most even coat possible, you'd overlap more like 90%. That's what guys who do candy paint jobs on cars with, you know, several $1,000 guns, that's what they're doing. But for the purpose of this, I'm sticking to about 50%, and it's working out just fine, I think. So pretty happy with how that's turning out so far. This is the amber from Mohawk, so you can check out the Mohawk stuff in the link in the description if you want, under Amazon or under Solo. I think I already said that in the intro of this video though, so I'll just leave it at that for now. I'm not going with a simple overlap pattern on this piece because on the front I've already got a pattern on there. There's a grain pattern and everything, and so I'm kind of playing with it a little bit, and I'm going to do something similar to what I do with the die on this if I need to. I go in and I'm going to add a whole bunch of paint here and then maybe sand it back a little bit, and I'm going around the edges a little bit extra, trying to kind of just see what looks good. You can always do a burst or something like that if you want to with this kind of thing. Lots of options. So that's what you see me doing here, is deliberately adding more to particular sections that I want to see more yellow in, to see if they'll darken up, to see, you know, if it's going to look good. It turns out it doesn't really darken that much, so I'm not ecstatic about the finish, and I end up going in with some sandpaper, some 800 grit, and taking a little bit of that off. So now you're seeing me spray the clear coat, also by Mohawk, of course, and I've gone in, I've waited a couple days, I've sanded some of that amber off of there, and, you know, I've tried to do it relatively evenly, but, you know, not too evenly, because I really like the patterning on the front, and I don't mind having a little bit of unevenness in the amount of amber on there, because I think it gives a pretty cool effect. You could use a Scotch-Brite pad to follow the contours and get everything a little bit more even if you wanted to. I did this with a standard sanding pad, foam backed, and by hand, and just kind of went at it that way until I was happy with it and left it at that. So now I'm going in with the clear coat, like I said, and I'm using a very similar process. Pretty straightforward here. Again, 50% overlap. This is the stringed instrument lacquer, and there's really not much else to tell you about this. We're going to clear coat this thing, I think, 4 times probably. At the end of the day, I don't want a high gloss finish on the back and the neck. I am using the gloss clear coat though, and I'm going to deal with that after. If you're building up clear coat and you want to do a satin finish, which is a sprayed finish, not something that you would buff in after really, you're going to want to do your build up work with the gloss clear because it doesn't have any satin or matting additives in it. And then you can go in after, sand that back a little bit with 800 grit paper and put a coat or 2 of the satin on there. The reason you don't want to build up a whole bunch of satin is because those additives can actually result in clouding. And that goes for polyurethanes and stuff as well. That's not unique to the lacquer. So I would suggest building up with gloss clear first. And then again, if you want to do one of those finishes, you can do it the way I'm going to do it. Or you can do it by sanding back and spraying some satin. So that's what we look like after the first round of clear coat. Looking pretty good in my opinion. Pretty happy with how that turned out. And we've got a good shine, which is kind of what we're looking for. I've got a bit of an open pore finish on the back, sides, and neck because I didn't do any grain filling there. So the front is grain filled and is going to have a nice hard gloss to it. And the rest is going to have that open pore finish that I am going to go ahead and take back from a gloss to something more like a satin. We'll cover that as the video progresses here. So this is just me clear coating again. This is a few days later, or maybe the next day, I can't really remember. And what I've done is I've gone in and sanded back my clear coat a little bit, just sanded it smooth with 800 grit. In fact, sanding it might even be an exaggeration. I used 800 grit sandpaper, but I just scuffed it up mostly so I could make sure that it was evened out a little and this next coat would stick. With nitrocellulose lacquer, you don't even necessarily need to do that for adhesion. It will bond chemically. But I did it anyway. Now I'm coming in with my sandpaper. I believe I'm using 1,000 grit here or 1,500 grit to start, and I'll probably finish off with 2,000 grit and then move on to the polishing process. I'm only doing that on the front of the guitar. Again, that's the only place I'm looking for a gloss finish, so that's the only place that I'm going to polish per se, and you'll see what I do with the rest to give it a really nice feel and a nice even satin-esque look. This is all sped up to 300%, as was my last spray session there. I think possibly the only thing more boring than flat sanding something is watching somebody flat sand something. So I'm using auto glass cleaner as a lubricant here because I don't want to use water because this is wood with lacquer on it and I don't want to risk cracking. So I'm using a little bit of that to help lubricate this paper because this isn't the really expensive sandpaper. If you're using the really nice stuff, you don't even need that. In fact, you may not want it. Dry sanding works just fine. I have no objection to dry sanding. I just wanted to do this to help the paper glide a little easier, partially because the pieces of sandpaper that I have are about the same size as my sanding pad. So it was really tough to hang on to them properly if I was doing it dry. But anyway, it works out. I'm using that auto glass cleaner. There's nothing wrong with that kind of option. There are a bunch of other options that you can use as well in place of water to avoid having your wood swell and possible cracking issues from that. So I'm sanding this all down, getting it as smooth as I can. I'm using a flexible sanding pad for this, as you can see. I don't want to just sand with my fingers. I don't want to put grooves in the finish or whatever. But I do want to use some kind of sanding pad, some kind of sanding block to make sure that I'm getting things nice and flat, at least in context of the curves that the guitar has. So on these carved tops, you can't really go in with a standard traditional sanding block. You really, unless you're very good at it, can't go in with an orbital sander, although I've done it before successfully. It's not what I would recommend per se, particularly with lacquer, which is a little bit softer and a little easier to sand through. Now, like I said, I'm doing this as a 2-step process, so I go ahead and finish up with my 1,000 grit paper, and then I move on from there. And in this case, I'm moving on to a 2,500 grit paper, which is fine enough for polishing on this kind of thing, especially if you've got a decent polisher, which I do. So that's going to work just fine. I don't need to jump through all of the hoops in between. I don't need to necessarily go, 1,250 grit, 15 or 1,200 grit, 1,500 grit, 2,000 grit, whatever. I don't need to do all of that. What I need to do, unlike when you're doing normal wood sanding, what I need to do here really is just take out the scratches from the prior grit. And so with a thicker, harder finish like a polyurethane, sure, sometimes it makes sense to go through all the grits, and I have no objection to that. But when you're doing something like a lacquer, you don't necessarily need to do that. It's a softer finish, and frankly, doing that increases your risk of burning through. And that's the last thing I want, is to burn through this whole finish and end up with just a patch with no finish on it. So now another thing that we get to test out in this video is the new polishing compounds from Oxford. You guys all know I love Oxford. I love Mohawk. They're basically my two favorite lacquer suppliers, companies, makers, whatever. And so I haven't tried these yet, these polishing compounds from Oxford. And this is my first crack at them. I'm using my Porter and Cable polisher and my usual Hex Logic or whatever it is. Chemical Brothers, I think, makes these polishing pads. They're all available in the Amazon link in the description under the polishing stuff if you want them. I'll put the Oxford link in the description as well, because as it turns out, just like all of the finishes that they make, their polish is pretty good. I like it. And it comes in a reasonable size container for those of you doing 1, 2, 3 guitars. It's pretty good. You know, a lot of the polishes that come out these days, my objection to many of them is that they come in a container that's only suitable if you're doing like 50 guitars or 3 cars or something like that, which, you know, some of you may need, but most of you probably don't. So I'm starting off with the medium compound. I'm going to move on from there, wipe it off, obviously, which I did off camera, and move on from there to the fine. But you can see that this is already looking pretty awesome in terms of shine. I'm using a softer, finer pad on this one and the fine polish now. It's a little bit wet because I cleaned these pads shortly before doing this, which isn't ideal because you do want to heat up your finish a little bit while you're doing this, but you don't want to heat it up too much. You don't want to risk burning through, so I just kind of have to account for that as I'm doing this. I end up wiping it all off and giving it a couple more passes, and you'll see shortly here what I end up with, but it turns out pretty darn good. So I get that all wiped off. I kind of get some of the water out of my pad. As always, you can see me spreading it around before I start up the polisher. I want to get polish all over my pad if I can and on the surface so that I don't end up in a situation where I'm just running dry foam pad against my finish, because that can damage it. With a foam pad, it's not that likely to happen, but it certainly can. I've seen it happen before. Lucky for me, I've never actually done it, but it's a possibility and I want to avoid it. And I suggest you do the same. So you can obviously do this with a much smaller polisher, and if you're using this Oxford compound, you can do it by hand too. If you're doing it by hand though, my suggestion is don't use a microfiber cloth. I get a lot of people coming to me saying, I polished and look what happened. I've got scratches everywhere. I've got these huge swirl marks. What happened? And for some reason, probably 70% of the time, it's somebody who used a microfiber cloth to polish because they thought that those couldn't leave scratches. So my recommendation is don't do that. Use an old t-shirt or something like that, an old lint-free piece of cotton that's been through the washing machine 100 times, and yeah, just use that. You can use that to polish. You can use a fresh one to wipe it off after, and you end up with something that looks more like this. You can see the reflection of the crap hanging on my wall there. So pretty happy with how that turned out. I love the gloss. I like all the stuff that I used for this. And yeah, let's move on, shall we? And get to work on the back after I'm done showing this off. Yeah, there you go. Nice and shiny. Okay, now for the back, I'm using some Odie's oil, and I'm going to apply this in the usual fashion, at least at first. I'm going to buff it off in a slightly different fashion from normal. If you've watched my little oil restoration video that I did a while back, or the short that I did on this, you'll already know what I'm going to do. But anyway, I'm applying this with a white non-abrasive Scotch pad. This is what the manufacturer recommends, so hey, who am I to argue with them? I think the one I'm using isn't really from them. It's probably got a touch of abrasive, which I am perfectly fine with in this situation. It all kind of depends on what you're looking for, but mine is just slightly abrasive, so it's going to knock back any imperfections in that finish. And again, we've got an open pore finish of sorts here, so when we look at it more closely after, you'll notice that you can see a few of those pores. Not many, because I did put sealer on this and clear coat, of course, so some of the bigger ones have been filled in, but I left some of the smaller ones have been filled in, but I left some of the bigger ones open. If you've been watching my channel for a while, you know I really like open pore finishes. I think they feel and look more natural, and they really kind of pay homage to the wood a little bit more, but not everybody will agree with me, and in fact, some people have already said they totally hate this guitar because of the wood selection. They think that the black limbo looks blotchy and shouldn't be accepted in guitar finishing, but whatever. I'm happy with it. I would choose it again if I had the opportunity. So there we go. That's what it looks like. I am using a wool pad. This is 45 minutes later. 45 minutes after I put the Odie's oil on, I went in with a wool pad on my buffer, turned the speed down slightly, and went in and basically buffed the oil. It's a hard wax oil, so you can do that. And this is what it looks like. Nice, even, satiny. I'm honestly ecstatic with how that turned out. So guys, as always, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please feel free to give it a thumbs up. I would appreciate it. It helps me out. And remember to subscribe so you can see how this series ends. Don't forget to check out Precision Guitar Kits, and I will see you next time. Have a good one.